This is Robinson's Electric from South River Model Works. The kit was released in 2010 and is one of 450 produced. This kit sells on eBay in the $250 to $350 range. Robert Van Gelder is the man behind South River Model Works. I think it was basically a husband-wife company. The company produced about one kit per year from 1991 to 2016 when Robert retired. As of the making of this video, the company website is still up and running. The company is based in Conway, Massachusetts, and the kits have somewhat of a New England look about them. Apparently, this one was actually based, although somewhat loosely, on a real building. The kit is one large wood building with some resin details, one medium building with stone walls cast in resin, and two small wood buildings. The resin castings are pretty high quality. There are also a number of cast metal accessories of nice quality and some laser cut wood pieces. Doors and windows are mostly plastic with some metal. This kit is pretty difficult. I made some mistakes early on and that threw me off, but I think the kit has some serious flaws which I will discuss in more detail later in the video. I really appreciate the amount of work that goes into producing these kits, but this build really frustrated me and I'm probably going to come off pretty negative on the kit. You can decide if you think I'm being unfair or not. It's too bad because I think this company makes some really interesting buildings, but I'm not likely to try another one. One of my complaints about this kit, and a lot of others, is that you are instructed to build the kit directly on the diorama base. That makes it pretty difficult to get onto a layout. You either have to build it onto the layout, or integrate the diorama into the layout, or do what I did and figure out how to build the building without a base. I did this because I don't know where I'm going to put it, or how I will want to integrate it in with the other scenery. One of the difficulties with this kit is the uneven foundation. Of course, I knew this when I bought it, so I expected the lower rear portion of the building, but the building front is actually not level either. You can build the kit without the lower rear portion, leaving the foundation mostly level except for the street elevation. This is my first kit from South River Model Works, and I really know nothing about the reputation for difficulty. So if you built one of their kits, I'd love to hear about your experiences with it. My first step in construction was cleaning up the resin walls. I had to cut out the windows and get rid of the flash. With resin pieces of this size, it's a good idea to wash them with some dish detergent to get rid of any residue that may remain from the casting process. In addition to the walls for the stone building, the little cupola on top of the main building is also resin. So are the storefronts. For the wood walls, one of the first things I do, even before bracing, is use a pounce wheel to add the nail holes. I'm using a thin piece of sheet plastic as a straight edge. I think this is a 1/4 inch pounce wheel. You can get these at art supply stores or on eBay. I really recommend this technique. I think it really enhances the appearance of the building. As I've done in some other kits, I'm going to cut away some sections of the clapboard. Then I'll rebuild the studs in the wall and the inner wall. This will make it look like the clapboard has fallen away. So yes, I'm going to build this as yet another worn and dilapidated building. Now I'm using scale 2x4s to add the studs to the walls. You can buy scale lumber from a variety of sources online. If you're going to build a lot of these kits, it's a good idea to stock up on some scale lumber of different sizes. Finally, I add in the inner wall. If you're going to do this right next to a door or window, it might interfere with putting the window into the building. However, in this case, I'm going to board up the windows, so it doesn't matter. Then on the front, I'm adding in a couple of boards on the top and the bottom of the hole. This makes it look like the hole has been partially patched. Another trick that people like to do to make these buildings look a little more worn is to raise up some of the clapboards using a razor blade. I find this actually pretty difficult and pretty tedious, so I don't do it a lot, but I'm trying to get some on this building. For the wood walls, I first painted them with a gray enamel primer, and now I am spray painting them with Vallejo concrete and then doing an overspray of Vallejo dirt. These are colors from the Vallejo Old and New Wood Effects kit. Now I'm spraying on some areas with a light sand color. This is all very subtle and may not have any effect on the actual final appearance of the building, but I think one of the tricks to getting a really interesting looking building is to build up a variety of colors as it would be in nature, even though any one specific color could be left out. The main building color is Folk Art Camel, and I'm applying that with a sponge. When I do this, I try to use heavy coverage throughout some sections of the walls and lighter coverage on other sections of the walls, rather than evenly distribute the paint across all of the walls. Looking at real buildings, it seems that most of the time paint does not chip off evenly. I use the stone building as an opportunity to experiment with some stone painting techniques. So the base color is Vallejo concrete. Now I'm applying some Americana avocado with a sponge. This is an old stone archway I found, and I'm using this as some inspiration for painting the stone building. This is on a bike trail. It used to be the Pennsylvania Railroad, and over the top of the archway is a road. But look at all the different colors. There's yellows, some greens, blacks, tans, browns. It's actually really hard to describe. So I really wanted to try and duplicate something with this rich of a palette of colors. So now I'm applying a little bit of black with a sponge. The next color is Folk Art Iced Coffee. The next step on the stone walls is a wash of Vallejo dark brown wash. I've tried using washes of cheaper paints, but they just don't flow as well, so I always go back to the Vallejo washes for this. Still not done with the stone walls, now I'm doing a dry brush of Tamiya Buff. The stone sections are starting to look pretty good. For the brick sections, I'm using Vallejo Whole Red. I will use a wash of a tan color to represent the brick mortar. If we go back and look at the stone archway, you can see that there is a lot of yellow lichen on the stone. I'm adding that with this Vallejo moss and lichen. This is a water-based product. The main building is going to have a green trim. I'm using two different types of paint. For cheap craft store paint, I'm using Americana Evergreen. But for high quality paint, I'm using Vallejo Luftwaffe Camo Green. I want to use the high quality paint on pieces like resin and plastic. And on wood, I can use the cheap craft store paint. Here I'm painting the front facade, which is cast in resin. Painting all of the resin, plastic, and metal pieces starts with a coat of Tamiya primer. This kit has a lot of windows. Most of them are plastic. Here I'm cleaning them up and sticking them on a piece of cardboard to get them ready for paint. I had to do some experimentation to find the best way to paint the resin facade pieces. First, I sprayed on Tamiya primer. Then I tried painting the Vallejo green paint right on top of the primer, but that left brush strokes. So then I decided to spray the entire piece with a green enamel spray paint from a spray can. Now I'm painting over again with the Vallejo green paint. The green camouflage spray paint just provided a better base coat for the green paint on top of it. At this point, the building facade is painted a solid green, so I want to give it a bit of a chipped paint look, so I'm applying some gray with a sponge. This particular section is the crown that goes around the roof. I'm doing the same thing with the windows. Prior to this, I had painted the windows with the Vallejo green, given a black wash, and then I dry brushed with a lighter green. The sponge alone didn't quite give me the look I was going for, so now I'm dry brushing on some tans and grays. It was a bit of a struggle, and I had to do a lot of experimentation to get just the right look I wanted on these resin pieces for the main building. But in the end, I got something I was pretty happy with. I was really playing around with some different techniques here, and so to mute those grays a little bit, I'm doing a wash of Vallejo dark green wash. So if at this point it looks like I don't know what I'm doing, that's probably not far from the truth. This is AK Interactive Decay Deposits, and this is an enamel product. I'm applying this to the facade of the building. It gives it a little bit of an old, worn look. It's kind of an interesting product, and I do like the look of it. The paper decals in this kit are on pretty thick paper, and so I want to scan them into the computer and reprint them on thinner paper. This is also a good idea if you just want to save a copy of the decals to use later, or in case you make a mistake cutting them apart. So what I'm doing is marking scale inches on the paper so that when I scan it, I know how to resize it to the same scale. After scanning, I open the image in Microsoft Word, and I can use the ruler in Microsoft Word to line up to these tick marks, and that way I know I'm printing at the same size. Now it's time to apply the signs to the walls, and I do this with white glue. Be very careful not to get any glue on the front of the sign when you do this. So I put the sign in place, and then I burnish it onto the wall using a round wood toothpick. I find that this works pretty well and does not tear the sign. If you want the sign to look painted onto the building, the paper that comes with the kit is really too thick. You're going to have to scan it and reprint it on thinner paper. I actually screwed up these signs a little bit. You can see that there's some white spots here. And I think what happened is I sprayed it with acrylic sealer before all of the glue had completely dried. You really want to wait like 24 hours. And I kind of forgot to do that. I forgot to wait, and this is the result of that. Since I'm weathering the signs, it doesn't really matter. And I have this one masked off so I can do some weathering with the sponge. But if I was doing this as unweathered, then this would be a pretty serious mistake to have made. Even though the signs didn't look that bad, it really wasn't the look that I was going for, and it really kind of haunted me through the rest of the build. That was my first major mistake. You really want to use an acrylic sealer over these paper signs because when you apply washes later, you want to protect the signs from damage from the wash. Now I'm using a sponge to apply Folk Art Barnwood just to the sign area. Doing a little more fiddling with the resin pieces, I'm applying some Folk Art Barnwood with a sponge, and I'm trying to be very delicate about it. I just want to get it in a few little areas. I need to prepare some wood strips to use as trim on the green building. So first I paint them gray, and then I apply Americana Evergreen with a sponge. I've braced the walls and painted the interior black, and now it's time to add the trim pieces. You want to make sure everything is laying flat on your work surface when you do this. The stone wall sections are cast resin. I'm gluing them together using 5-minute epoxy, and I'm going to use some blocks of wood in the corners to reinforce the joint. Whenever you have these buildings that are made out of two different materials, like in this case resin and wood, it's always kind of tricky to make sure that the walls of one material line up with the walls of the other material. So you always want to be checking their measurements on this. I found some pictures of curtains on the internet. I reduced them in size, printed them out, and I glued them to the inside of the facade. Now I'm also adding some signs. One of the decal sheets is specifically designed to fit into the facade windows so that when you look through the windows, you see these specific signs. I'm gluing these in using Testors cement for clear parts. These are sign pictures which I found on the internet. I printed them out and put them on some cardstock to keep them stiff. These were left over from my Wachter Apartments build. So I found out that you can use Testors cement for clear parts, put them on the front of the sign, and glue it right to the window, and the glue will not show in the window. This is where the assembly starts to get tricky. You have this full-size template of the floor plan, and now I need to cut some wood strips to the correct size and angles. The walls of the building do not sit flat, so you have to use these wood blocks to prop up some sections of the walls. You're going to see that this is a fairly significant problem later on. Here I'm gluing the wood spacer to the bottom of the side wall of the building. The facade wall also gets a spacing block. Because the facade wall is made of resin, I'm using super glue gel to glue the spacer. Now it's finally time to start gluing the walls together. If I were following the instructions, this would all be done on the diorama base. But since I am not building this as part of a diorama, I have to build it as a standalone building. This is making it a little bit tricky because of the uneven nature of the foundation. I'm using a clothespin to support the wall. And now I'm adding in the upper level rear wall. As I'm gluing the building together, I need to make sure that the resin crown pieces are going to fit. One of my complaints about this kit is I don't think that the bracing diagrams are very good. Here I'm adding some extra bracing to support the wall on top of the facade. Now it's time to glue together the front of the building, and this is where you really have to be careful with your angles. Now, gluing together the front of the building, I'm using the roof piece to make sure I get the correct angles. I'm using wood glue for wood-on-wood connections, and I'm using 5-minute epoxy for wood-on-resin connections. Let me see if I can explain the problem with this build. So this wall is in place, and because of the notch, it comes up about this far on the front facade. So if you follow that around, and I tried to keep that even, so it's the same distance coming around. Then we get over to this side. And now this is how much of a gap there is. So depending on how far forward or to the rear of this facade piece you put the wall, it affects the geometry. So my geometry is off. So here's the roof piece. So of course everything has to fit this roof cap because it's fixed. You can't change that. So the cardboard is just a little bit smaller than the roof piece, and that's intentional apparently. So you have to make all of your angles fit the roof piece. And so it kind of seems like I need to somehow trim away some of that wall or something. So I'll remove this trim piece and see what happens. See if that makes it fit. But I don't think that's going to be enough. So just in general, the difficulty of an angled building like this is that your measurements, both the kit builder and the kit manufacturer, the measurements have to be really exact, otherwise it just doesn't line up. And to make it worse, the way they've designed this piece, you don't have any ability to adjust this to kind of make everything fit. So we'll see what I can do to make that work. That's not really something I blame the manufacturer for, considering that this is partly wood and partly resin and some of the angles are fixed. It's just, there's not really going to be a good way to get all of the angles to fit together and have the building come out perfect for every builder. It's always going to need some adjustment. I want to get the window panes into the building before the building is fully assembled. I think it'll be pretty difficult to access these window areas otherwise. Generally, I like to wait until the building is assembled before I put in the window panes, but in this case, I don't really have another choice. Now it's time to glue the stone walls to the wood walls on the back of the building. This is how the walls are coming together with the roof properly in place as best as it will fit. And this is gap number 1. And this is gap number 2. How big is this gap? It's kind of like that. So what I've decided to do is glue the roof piece onto the 2 front walls, and I am basically going to, as much as possible, make everything fit the roof, and then wherever there are gaps in the walls, I'm going to fill them and paint them some kind of color. I believe that my mistake is that this wall is supposed to come farther out over this facade piece by about a millimeter. That doesn't seem like it should be enough to fix this problem. His build clearly does not have these problems, but maybe he spread this angle a little bit more. You only have to be off on this angle a little tiny bit to have a big gap over here, so just even sanding or just how you glue it or the surface of the casting is enough to have variation to make a gap over here. So there's supposed to be a loading dock here anyway and a canopy, so I think I can cover that up pretty well. With all the walls glued in together, on this corner, the width of the gap was about a 1/16 inch square piece of wood, so that's how I filled it. On this corner, it was a 1/16 inch square piece of wood, and a 1/8 inch square piece of wood, and that filled it in pretty decently. So overall, I would say that considering all the angles and everything, it's a pretty reasonable fix for that. The kit comes with paper shingles and sheets that are pre-cut into strips. So I'm gluing them on using spray adhesive. It's a good idea to spray the underside of the roof card and the edges of the roof card black before applying the shingles or applying the roof card to the building. There are a lot of shingles in this kit, as all 4 buildings have shingled roofs. The 2 smaller buildings are pretty simple. I painted the wood the same base color as I did for the large building, and here I'm applying white with a sponge. Of the 2 small buildings, one of them is all wood walls, and the other one has a wood front, and then the other walls are cardboard covered with wood strips. Now I'm starting to put the crown around the roof. I'm using 5-minute epoxy for that. I also use 5-minute epoxy to put together the walls of the stone building. Fortunately, epoxy on resin is not really all that strong of a bond. I was just assembling the stone building and I realized I glued this wall on upside down. So we will come back to that building. So here's another mistake that I made. On the top of these walls, you're supposed to put this trim, so it sits actually on top of the wall and then trims all around, and then the cardboard goes on top of these square pieces. These are 1/8 inch square pieces. So what I thought we were supposed to do is take a strip like this and, like in this case, put it around underneath the cap after you put the cap on, so it looks like that. Because if you do it the way the instructions say, you're going to have the edge of the cardboard exposed all the way around, kind of like it is here. It doesn't look terrible, but it doesn't look that great. So my way was to cover up the edge of the exposed cardboard. Kind of like that, which I think looks better. So the only place where that kind of makes a difference is in this little section here where there's just not enough room because of this door, but it's in the back and it's only off by a very small amount, so it doesn't really matter. But the other reason that that matters is that some of these, there's a little bit of a gap between the resin cap and the cardboard, so this is going to cover up that gap. It's kind of hard to see, but it's in there. So I think it's going to give a nice, neater appearance. So I'm going to get working on those. I was gluing on this roof and it left a giant gap there. So another example of things not really going very well. So I'm going to try and remove it. The glue hasn't completely dried yet. It's been about an hour. You always have to be really careful about pieces shifting as the glue sets. Fortunately, with these wood kits, it's pretty easy to cut things apart when you make a mistake. That was actually a good thing in a way, because I realized I really need to paint these support pieces down here because they're visible through these windows. So while I have the roof off, I'm going to do that. This is the sheet of paper that they provide for the tar paper roof strips. Normally I would like to apply these strips using spray adhesive, but since the roof is already on the building, that's going to be kind of difficult. So I'm using white glue. The problem is that kind of causes the strips to wrinkle a little bit. I know some people use double-sided tape to apply roof strips like this, and that would have been a good idea in this case. Here is the cupola for the building, and it is cast resin. These window sections are paper and they're laser cut. It's actually kind of tricky to get them positioned correctly because you're putting them in blind. You can't see whether it's centered. By the time you turn it over to look, the glue has already set. So really, 5-minute epoxy would have been a better choice in this case. Now it's time to glue the cupola walls together. The walls had a pretty significant curve to them. They were warped, so I had to put some bracing in to flatten them out. I have to do some filing to get a good tight fit of the crown. Now it's time for rafter tails. They don't provide a template for how to cut the rafter tails with the correct angle. You have to figure that out yourself. It's not that big of a deal, it's just one more minor annoyance in this kit. The rear of the main building has this little overhang extension made out of cardboard. It gets covered in corrugated metal. These sections of brick pattern on the decal sheet go around the base of the building. How does that look? Do you think that looks okay? Because I sure don't. So I put on this paper brick covering, and I think it looks really kind of pretty ridiculous. And here is really what I think is the biggest flaw with this kit, is the street elevation. So here, if you go from here to here, then you have about 2 millimeters or 1/16 of an inch where this is exposed. So your street elevation has to come up and somehow make over this little hump area and then come across. So here's your street elevation here, and here's it here. Well, how many people on their layout can handle that specific change in elevation? And then it comes over here, and granted there's a loading dock here that kind of covers stuff up, but it comes over here, and now you have this paper exposed. So I think what's really bugging me is this paper. It's such an expensive kit. Why would you cheap out on that and just go to like a paper brick covering where it's going to be visible? So that to me is the biggest frustration. So just look at this contrast. This brick here and this brick here. I don't know how you make that look good, and it's going to be exposed because the ground cover is not going to come all the way up to this door area. And if it did, then you have this area here where it's going to cover up the facade of the building. So that doesn't really make any sense to me. And for a kit of this price, and it's not their first kit, they've been making a lot of kits, it's a really weird decision to have done it that way. This really was just so aggravating. So I decided that I was going to remove these wood supports and this paper, and I was going to come up with something else to do here. Cutting this wood off was actually pretty difficult. I was always on the verge of either cutting my fingers off or destroying the building. These are plaster retaining wall sections that I got from New England Brownstone, and they are pretty good carvings. They're a little pricey, but the price is in line with the quality. So I've painted them up, of course. They came white because they're plaster. And on the side and back of the building, I was able to remove the wood strip that was here, and I've added in a row of the plaster stones. And I think it looks a lot better. And in this section, when I install it to the layout, I'll add another plaster section here. I just didn't think it would be that easy to install onto the layout with that section in there, so I'll wait and see what I need and where it's going to go. These stone strips are nice because they're easy to cut, and then you just stack them up to whatever height you need. And so I painted up more than I'll need. I'll find places for them elsewhere. I'm sure I'll have no trouble. Now it's time to attach the rear overhang extension. I was not at all happy with my first attempt to paint the roof, and I had to add a cap strip anyway, so now I'm coming back and repainting everything with a base coat of gray. For the shingled roofs, I will mostly be painting them with an airbrush, and I will use some washes and some dry brushing. Here I'm adding the shingles for the stone building, and I'm applying those with spray adhesive. The stone building has this rooftop section called a clerestory. This is built out of laser cut cardboard with some paper sheets to add details. Well, here's another of the little landmines in this kit. These pieces actually had a top and a bottom. They just look so symmetrical, and I didn't realize I had put them on wrong until after I looked at them and they were glued together. So I have to cut them apart and re-glue them the correct way. Finally, there are some loading docks, 2 for the stone building and 1 for the main building, and you build them over this template using the scale lumber they provide. This is another example of the little landmines that are in this kit, that little annoyances that keep adding up. So there are 2 loading docks for this building, and I built them following this diagram. So they're the height following this diagram. But when you look at them to the building, this loading dock, this door, the base of this door is lower than the loading dock by about 1/4 of an inch. So if I line up the base, that's how much the loading dock sticks down. So it looks like it's off by 1/4 of an inch. So he has this little sort of disclaimer in here that the length of the posts are going to vary depending on your groundwork. Well, that's kind of a cop-out. I think this is really just laziness on the part of the kit manufacturer to not provide a diagram that actually matches the building. So yeah, I know you're supposed to read the instructions, but this is just going a little too far. It's kind of ridiculous. I'm getting close to the end, and I really need to just finish up painting the roofs. And so I've put on a base color of gray or some kind of brown, depending on which building it is. And now I'm applying a wash of Vallejo dark brown. One of the last bits of weathering I'm doing on the building is a light wash of folk art barnwood or Americana traditional burnt umber. On the smaller buildings I used some weathering powders, but I didn't use any weathering powders on the large building because I didn't really want to mask off all of these windows. After applying weathering powders, you typically want to put some kind of a sealer on, and if you don't mask off the windows, the sealer will fog up the windows. For sealers, I typically use Testors Dull Coat or Tamiya Flat Clear or some kind of an acrylic sealer. Here on the rear of the building, you can see that there are 2 windows that are boarded up. This is just a sheet of thick paper cut to scale 4 foot by 8 foot and then painted to look like old weathered plywood. On the main building, I'm weathering the roof with a wash of a couple different colors of tans and browns. This is the sidewalk section that comes with the kit for the front, along the front of the building, and it actually includes these steps to run steps down to the side to the lower level. So those look kind of nice. But I'm going to save that until I actually try to install the building onto my layout.